Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To contact me, please send your emails to rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author, a public historian, and a spanking brand new Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. The confirmation came to me this week, and I have to say that I'm absolutely thrilled by the honour and the confirmation. Thank you, fellows, or thank you, fellows, and the Society, of course, and I look forward to participating in your events. I'm so thrilled. In the last podcast, we went through the rise of William Wallace, right the way through to the end of the Battle of Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September, 1297, and that amazing Scottish victory. And basically, I'm just going to jump straight in from there. So just to recap quickly, the Scottish army with William Wallace and Andrew Murray as generals had defeated the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and now they are in a commanding position. Just a few days after the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the English army inside of Stirling Castle surrendered because of the lack of provisions. The person who was left in charge of Stirling Castle was Commander Tweng. William Wallace spared his life because of his bravery on the battlefield that he had shown during the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and sent him and some of his knights back to England. It's also notable that Robert the Bruce was not at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Although he supported Scottish independence, his allegiance wasn't yet firmly established. He had this fluctuating relationship between the English crown and the Scottish cause, partly due to his noble status and the political pressures of the time. And keep in mind, he was not just a lord or a laird in Scotland. He was also a lord in England and carried English titles and owned English land. So it's quite a complicated issue. From there, Wallace and Murray, and keep in mind that Murray is injured, having taken a sword blow to the stomach, roam the central part of Scotland, killing the English wherever they find them, taking over Edinburgh, Roxburgh, and Berwick, and burning the northern towns as they come across them. Wallace and Murray then took control of the Scottish government in the name of the absent king, John Balliol. Keep in mind, he is in the Tower of London. Edward has him locked up. Interestingly, Edward I always believed that William Wallace was trying to become King of the Scots, whereas he never was. William Wallace was actually trying to restore John Balliol back to the throne. You can see how Edward would come to that conclusion, though. Wallace is a strong leader, whereas John Balliol, I mentioned in the last podcast, he was actually considered to be the empty jacket or the tomb tabard. That was really just a puppet for Edward. But he started to show more leadership qualities as the years went on, which then led to his subsequent arrest and his imprisonment in the Tower of London. So at that point, when they're in Berwick, and keep in mind, Berwick is one of these towns that keeps swapping between the English and the Scottish. Every time the English advance, they take it. Every time the Scots kick them out, they take Berwick back. But Berwick is effectively one of the main trading ports to Europe. So while they're in Berwick, both Wallace and Murray write to the merchants of the German ports a letter that actually still exists to this day, signed by both Wallace and Andrew Murray, to state that Scotland had regained power back from England and that trade would now resume between Germany and Berwick and therefore Scotland. When they signed the document, they signed it as the commanders of the army of the Kingdom of Scotland and the community of that realm. As I mentioned in the previous podcast, Andrew Murray was severely injured during the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and it was a few months after the Battle of Stirling Bridge when he very sadly died. This, of course, then led Wallace to become the sole leader of the Scots. Now, the English armies, they had built these massive siege machines called trebuchets that were effectively the nuclear option of the time, used effectively for bombarding castles. And the biggest one they had was called Warwolf. It was the biggest of them all, and it took 3 months to assemble. So if they besieged a castle, the first thing they would do is start to build Warwolf. And usually what happened was that when the castle, the inhabitants of the castle saw it being assembled, they would surrender rather than wait for it to be built and then to be attacked by it. And it was this amazing machine that could literally hurl boulders as almost as big as a house into the castle. So you can imagine the damage that it would do. William Wallace and his army didn't have trebuchets at their disposal. They had nothing of the kind. So instead of trying to destroy big buildings, castles and the like, when they besieged them, when they marched over the border into England, probably in the early part of 1298, their only option was to burn everything in their wake. So they burned every village that they came across, effectively so that the advancing English army would have nothing to feed off if and when it decided to march north. So they burned everything. And there was a psychological effect in doing this too. If an advancing army sees what you want it to see, as in a desolate, burnt country, it's definitely not going to lift your spirits. So there's method to their madness. By the time they finished, there were no churches to take solace in. There were no homes for the English to rest in. There was nothing for anyone to settle back into. And they invade England as far as Newcastle. Then they head into a village called Durham. Obviously, Durham is now a large city, but it was a little village back then. And they're now actually 70 miles inside the English border. They're well and truly invading England, and there's no opposition. However, it's here that they actually run into some extremely bad weather conditions, one of the worst storms of the year. And the Scots, being incredibly superstitious, probably the most superstitious nation on earth, in their wisdom, they believed that this was due to the patron saint of Durham, St. Cuthbert, protecting the people of Durham. So they then decide to turn around and head home. If truth be told, I think it was a mixture of the weather. For sure, it was cold. It was freezing cold and raining continuously, and they were mostly sleeping outdoors. I think that combined with homesickness, the Scottish are an amazingly home-countied people. They miss their families. They were hungry. You combine that with the superstition of St. Cuthbert, and they head back to Scotland with their heads held high. So at this point, when the Scots returned back to Scotland, Wallace is actually returned as leader of the Scottish army. It was at that point, at that stage, that the nobles decided to award Wallace two titles. He was given the title of Sir William Wallace, so he was knighted, and that was probably around late February or early March in 1298, and he was elected as the sole guardian of Scotland. Effectively, he had all the rights of a king, but he obviously couldn't be king because he was not of royal blood. So therefore, he couldn't actually physically be called the king, especially with John Balliol imprisoned in the Tower of London. But someone had to be in charge of the government, someone had to inspire the people, and someone had to be in charge of the army. And this was Sir William Wallace. And by all accounts, he was an incredibly inspirational leader. And he was the guy that effectively galvanized the nobles, who were playing a very intricate game of chess with their lands and titles in England at stake. Meanwhile, Edward I was sick and tired of hearing about William Wallace. The entire nation was speaking about him. His name was ringing around in Edward's head, and he didn't like it. His nobles talked about him in awe. He was being talked about in the alehouses. And the English actually feared that if he were to invade in the spring, with the good weather just round the corner, he could well take England all the way down to London. So during the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Edward was actually fighting another war in France. He'd just beaten the Welsh. He was now in France, and now he had to contend with the Scots. He's not in England, but Wallace's name is even being mentioned in France too. So Edward heads home to address this upstart. And he knows that to find him, he's going to have to venture to Scotland. And he's going to need the help of his Welsh and Irish barons. William Wallace, on the other hand, has no interest in invading England any further. And he also knows that it's just a matter of time before Edward seeks him out. So he plans and puts a lot of effort readying his army for the next battle. The heavy horse, large horses that wear armor, this is one of England's secret weapons. These horses, completely armored with a knight, hit you at about 30 miles an hour. It's akin to a tank smashing through a straw wall. And this is Wallace's main concern. So Wallace comes up with an idea called a sheltron, which is a hedgehog-like formation. And effectively, to imagine what these things are like, if you can imagine a massive circle of men, say 1,000 men, holding 12-foot-long sharpened wooden spears with more men on the inside with their swords and axes drawn, that basically look like a hedgehog when it's protecting itself with all its spikes out, then you have a good mental picture of what a sheltron is. The only issue with them is that they're static. Once formed, you have to wait for the enemy to come to you, and this is a big flaw. Keep in mind also, the Scots are an army of foot soldiers. They are fanatical hand-to-hand fighters, and they need to get close to do their work. So the sheltrons would work well for them as long as the English charge into them. Edward, on the other hand, wants Wallace wiped off the face of the earth, and after the defeat of Stirling Bridge, he takes no chances. The thing about Edward is that he's incredibly clever, and he's been in more battles than any other English king in history. He's underestimated the Scots once. It will not happen again. So he arrives in Scotland with the largest force of heavy cavalry that has ever been assembled. 10,000 knights in total. The ground shook and wavered for miles when they were in full gallop. So the cavalry stopped for the evening at Roxburgh on the borders of Scotland by June of about 1298. It's summertime and the weather is good for the horse and for the men. They stayed there for about a month, after which their provisions started to dwindle. In the meantime, they have scouts out trying to find Wallace. In July 1298, they start to head north looking for Wallace and his army, and he simply can't be found. After searching for them for another month, Edward has decided that he's just going to retreat back to Edinburgh. He can't find the Scottish army. He can't find Wallace. So he retreats and he gets probably about as far as Lithgow, sort of central Scotland, very near Stirling, when they hear a report from two defected Scottish earls who had been promised more land and more titles in England that William Wallace isn't that far away at all. In fact, he's just about 10 miles outside of a town called Falkirk. Wallace, on the other hand, is quite surprised the following day to find that the English army was now advancing upon his position. The night before the Battle of Falkirk, King Edward has much concern that the Scots are going to do a sneak surprise because they're very good guerrilla fighters and they're going to attack in the dead of the night. So he actually orders his men to lie down next to their horses. So effectively to sleep next to their horses, fully armored. But while Edward himself was sleeping next to his own horse, it trod on him in the middle of the night, breaking several ribs. And this then leads to a small panic in the army because they think that their king has been disabled. Obviously, he's injured and that the battle may not go ahead. They may have to retreat. And if news of that reaches the Scots, they would advance and easily defeat them. Edward's tougher than that, though, and it takes more than a few broken ribs to stop him. As I said before, he's the veteran of many a battle. So the Battle of Falkirk takes place on the 22nd of July, 1298. Wallace's position is on the slope of a hill. The Scots loved being at the top or on the slopes of hills, and they loved using that momentum of charging down into their enemy to try and take advantage. Wallace has arranged his spearmen in 4 massive circular sheltrons, and in between the sheltrons, he places his archers. These guys are short-range bowmen, deadly within 50 feet. They can pierce armor at 50 feet. But that also meant that you had to let the enemy in close for them to be effective. Behind them was a small selection of Scottish cavalry, whose job it was to ride down the English bowmen after the Scottish archers had done their job. Edward, however, unbeknownst to the Scots, had employed about 1,000 Welsh longbowmen, and this was the first time that they were going to be seen on the battlefield, And the longbow can actually shoot through soldiers' armor easily at a range of 250 yards. This was his secret weapon. This is how he crushed the Scots army at Falkirk. At one, when they fired, the arrows blocked out the sun, and as the arrows rained down on the Sheltrons, the Scots died in their hundreds. There was no protection against them whatsoever. Very quickly, the Scots were in a panic, and Edward then sent in the heavily armored horse. All 10,000 of them slow galloped forward past the archers, and then they charged. The defeat is decisive. Wallace calls for a retreat, and those that could stand ran. About 4,000 men lost their lives that day, and Wallace's reputation as a general suffered. He, however, managed to escape, and he went into hiding for a number of months. He had a massive price on his head, and it was rumored that he then traveled to Europe. He had to get out of Scotland, and that he even had an audience with the Pope. Keep in mind also, Wallace spoke fluent Latin, Italian, and French, and he would have been very much at home there. And his discourse and insights with the Pope would have been very welcomed. The church had a huge play on everything that happened in England and Scotland politically. It was the church that effectively told the kings and the queens what to tell their people, what to believe and who to believe in, and they were the ones calling the shots. So they would have definitely been interested to hear what Wallace had to say. Before Wallace left Scotland, he sent word to the ruling council resigning his position as Guardian of Scotland. He was to be replaced by a man called John Comyn and by Robert Bruce, who will shortly become known as Robert the Bruce. And between Comyn and Bruce, there was no love lost. So William Wallace is away for 4 years. That's a long time. He left in 1298 and arrives back in Scotland to no fanfare. He doesn't tell anyone that he's back in 1302. He then joins the army, interestingly, as a common soldier, and in 1303 is part of the victory at the Battle of Roslin. This is the same Roslin Chapel that was later to become rather famous in Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code. 35,000 men lost their lives in the ensuing battle over the next few days. The Scots were led by John Comyn at the time, and as I mentioned, Sir William Wallace was just a simple soldier. He never returned back as leader, and he didn't want to be recognized as one either. In 1304, nothing is spoken of Wallace. He stays with the army as effectively as a private and trains like the rest of the men. And then in 1305, he's actually betrayed by one of his closest friends. Wallace had been sought after for just over 7 years, since the Battle of Falkirk, but he had managed to elude everyone. Now, in the film Braveheart, there is a scene where Wallace is betrayed by Robert the Bruce and Robert the Bruce's father, Robert Bruce. This is a complete lie. Robert the Bruce wasn't even in the country at the time of Wallace's betrayal. And if truth be told, they actually respected each other quite a lot. Keep in mind also that even to this day, the Scots revere both men. And Robert the Bruce is not one of the best warrior kings that Great Britain has ever produced. And of course, Wallace is still a national hero. So to think that the Bruce would betray him, I don't think it happened. And in the research that I've done, I've never seen anything to the contrary. Wallace, as far as I can tell, was actually betrayed by a man called John Menteith, who was a Scottish knight who changed allegiances a few times during the Wars of Independence. At this stage, he was loyal to Edward I, but he was also a very good friend of Wallace. So Wallace was captured, he was trussed and bound and bloodied, and then turned over to the English army near where the town of Rob-Royston now stands near Glasgow. Rob-Royston is at a very much later date, some 300-400 years later, would actually be named after Rob Roy MacGregor, the infamous Scottish cattle rustler. So Wallace is captured, he is taken down to England, and it takes them roughly 18 days to get there. He was forced to walk the entire way and given little food or water. I'm also sure that if he was to fall at any point, he was probably dragged until he got back up to his feet. But he was taken all the way down to London and prisoned in Westminster Hall, where he was put on trial and accused of 138 different charges, the main one of which being treason. Treason is an incredibly serious criminal offense, even now, involving actions that betray or undermine one's own country. And typically, treason includes acts such as attempting to overthrow the government, aiding enemies, during wartime, or engaging in activities that severely compromise national security. The issue here is that Sir William Wallace wasn't English. He was Scottish, and Scotland had their own king. So treason is the one count that an English court definitely couldn't hold against him. So what you then have to ascertain that for the English, this trial is entertainment, pure and simple. Here stands a man that embarrassed and beat the English at war. This is them having their turn with him. So most of the time that Wallace is in the dock at Westminster Hall, he remains silent. However, when he is told that he was going to be tried for treason, he speaks for the first time and says, "How can you try me for treason when England is foreign to me? My allegiance lies with my king, the King of Scots, John Balliol." The trial was a complete mockery, and regardless of what was said or what he did, he was going to be found guilty, and he was going to be executed. It was also made very clear that Sir William Wallace was not going to be tried as a nobleman, which of course he was. He was tried as a commoner because the English courts refused to recognise that Wallace had been given a title by another Scottish nobleman. This is actually a very big deal because as a nobleman, if you're found guilty, you're beheaded. As a commoner, you are hung, drawn, and quartered. In the movie Braveheart, they showed the executioner offering Sir William Wallace mercy if he confesses all his crimes and swears allegiance to King Edward I. But at no point was he offered mercy. Let's just be clear on that, and we have the court records to attest for it. Wallace is found guilty, and from Westminster Hall, he is taken to the Tower of London, some 2 miles distance. There he is stripped naked and put in a small open wagon, which then takes him to the streets of London, all the while being pelted by stones and rotten fruit and vegetables until he arrives at his execution place, which is Smithfield Market. By this stage, he's already badly injured, as the London crowds took no prisoners, so to speak. They were throwing rocks, as I mentioned, so he was in quite a bad state by the time he got there. There he is taken from the board, and a noose is tied around his neck, and he is hung. 4 men pull him up and wait for his struggles to cease, and then they let go of the rope, and he crashes to the ground unconscious. All the while, the crowd are loving the entertainment, because that's what it is for them. Public executions in the 13th century often attracted massive crowds, and they had a carnival-like atmosphere. Wallace would have attracted most of London. Here was the man that had invaded England, and no one had done that since William the Conqueror. As the vendors sold bread, meat, pies, ale, other trinkets were also sold, like pieces of rope fashioned into a hangman's noose. There would have been street performers, jugglers, and musicians, all earning a penny or two, taking advantage of the large crowds. Wallace at this stage was revived with a cold bucket of water, and then put on the stretching rack where he was stretched, his arms popping out of their sockets. Then his testicles and penis were both removed and thrown into the cheering crowd. An incision was then made in the lower part of his belly to retrieve his bowels, which were then shown to the crowd, and then, finally, they cut off his head. His heart was then cut out, still beating, shown to the crowd, and then thrown into the crowd. Sir William Wallace's body was then cut into 4 separate pieces. The head was put on a spike on London Bridge and displayed for all to see, for everyone who would think of committing treason against Edward I. It stayed there for several months. The 4 parts of his body were then sent to the 4 parts of the kingdom. 1 piece was sent to Stirling, another to Perth, and then Berwick and Newcastle. And the reason that they did this was so that there was no specific burial place. There was no one place for people to worship him, to pay their respects, and more specifically, no one place where he could be martyred. Wallace's skull was eventually taken to Edward I and placed in a box that he kept in his bedroom. It is believed still to be in the possession of the English monarchy today. And the rumor is it is being held in a box in Buckingham Palace archives. So Wallace is now dead, and this is where we see the emergence of Robert the Bruce. Just to give you a bit of colour on Robert, Robert the Bruce was born on July the 11th, 1274 at Tunbury Castle in Ayrshire in Scotland, and was the son of Robert Bruce, 6th Lord of Anningdale, and Marjorie, Countess of Carrick. Robert the Bruce was the grandson of Robert Bruce. I know it gets a bit confusing, especially as his father was also called Robert Bruce, but his grandfather, just to distinguish them, was known as Robert Bruce the Competitor, and he was the man who had signed the ragman roll and who opposed John Balliol to become king. Robert the Bruce was the oldest child of 7 children. He himself became the Earl of Carrick in 1292 when his father resigned the title to be named the successor of the Bruce clan to the throne of Scotland. The thing with Robert the Bruce in the movie Braveheart, and it was shown in a very aggressive way, was the fact that he was shown to support the Scots and then support Edward I at the same time. And it's sort of true, but it's more complicated than that. The Bruce family, as I mentioned before, were super political players, and they owned land and titles in both Scotland and England and Ireland. So yes, did they flop between Scottish independence and Edward I? Absolutely. But most of the lords of the land did at that particular time. So Robert was Earl of Carrick. Edward, his brother, was Lord of Galloway. Isabel, his sister, became Queen of Norway. It's quite the family. They were a proud family who played a tight political game. If they were seen to support John Balliol or William Wallace, Edward would strip them of their lands in Cumberland and Northumberland and in Ireland. So they had to play the game well. Robert eventually marries Isabel of Mar, the daughter of the Earl of Mar, but unfortunately she dies 1 year later in 1296 while giving birth to a daughter, whom they name Marjorie. Robert the Bruce and another man called John Comyn, on the back of the death of Andrew Murray and William Wallace, are now named as joint guardians of Scotland. John Comyn was Lord of Badenoch and Lord of Lochbar. In 1299, they were joined by Bishop Lamberton from Glasgow. So effectively, there's now 3 guardians of Scotland. But Bruce actually resigns his post as guardian, as he and Comyn don't see eye to eye. They had opposing ideas, and both had legitimate claims to the Scottish throne. John Comyn, however, at this particular time, was a staunch supporter of Edward I. And Robert the Bruce, on the other hand, at this particular time, couldn't quite get to grips with the murder of Sir William Wallace, and as having Edward as his overlord. So he was in a slight state of flux. However, in 1302, it seems that Bruce is actually playing the game a little bit better. And at this stage, to all outsiders, he and Edward are getting along actually just fine. In fact, Edward likes him so much and respects his family so much, he actually takes it one step further, issuing a document to the Bruces guaranteeing their freedom and safety, and also to the people of Carrick their freedom and safety if they're ever attacked by any opposing force. He also gives permanent possession of the lands of Carrick to Robert the Bruce, meaning that that land can never be taken away from him. And I have to say, at this stage, when you read back through the annals of history and the documentation, it's actually hard to tell who is supporting Scotland and who is supporting England at this stage. And the game, as I've mentioned before, is incredibly complex. So much so that a northern noble called Robert de Ross, just as an example, he actually created a password so that he would know. And that password was Tabard. And the point is, you wouldn't be able to tell just by the way that someone spoke or the way that they dressed if they were actually supporting the English or the Scottish. So you had to have ways of working out who was on your side. And Robert de Ross created a password that would allow him to, tell if someone was actually a supporter of the king or a supporter of Balliol. And at this stage, because Berwick changes hands so often, it's a real misnomer to think that this is actually a war of attrition between England and Scotland. Robert the Bruce, like Edward I, I think is a real opportunist at this point. And I don't think he actually really set his sights on becoming King of Scotland, but it went that way after he found himself in a very difficult position. Bruce had effectively arranged to meet with John Comyn, his leading rival, in a place called Greyfriars Kirk, or Church, in Dumfries. This meeting took place on the 13th of February. Both men go in, and not 20 minutes later, Robert the Bruce exits alone. He has killed John Comyn. With his main rival dead and the potential for open rebellion now in Scotland, Robert the Bruce decided that he might as well go for gold. So he goes for the role as King of the Scots. So he has himself crowned at Scone Palace, the traditional site of the Scottish coronations, and then he claims Scotland for his own. This is actually a really dramatic time for him because not only is he then excommunicated by the Pope then excommunicates Scotland. He excommunicates an entire country. You know, excommunication is not just a religious censor, but it's quite comprehensive. It's a comprehensive measure that actually affects the spiritual, social, and sometimes even the political life of the individuals. And what this does is it, especially when you excommunicate a country, it means that the people of Scotland aren't able to participate in services. They can't receive the sacraments, such as the Eucharist and the confession. They can't hold any religious office or function. And, you know, for many believers, you know, the most profound consequence is the fear of eternal damnation. The church actually teaches that being in a state of excommunication at the time of death without repentance can actually result in the eternal separation from God. This is serious stuff. And of course, Edward is furious, as you can imagine, and this has serious consequences for the Bruce family. They immediately lose their land and titles in England. Bruce's wife and daughter are captured by Edward I and imprisoned. Thomas Bruce, the Bruce's brother, is captured by the English in 1306 and executed. They hang, draw, and quarter him. Neil Bruce, the other brother, suffers the same fate. Christina, Bruce's sister, is imprisoned but later released as a prisoner exchange. Mary Bruce, another sister, is actually captured and imprisoned in a cage exposed to the public at Roxburgh Castle. And another sister, Matilda or Maud Bruce, is also imprisoned. The family is completely devastated. Edward I then continues his campaigns to subdue Scotland and battle Bruce. This goes on for years, and in later years, Edward's health actually begins to decline. He suffered from various ailments, you know, the most serious, reoccurring bouts of dysentery. And in 1307, despite his deteriorating health, Edward embarks on another campaign to quell the Scottish resistance. And he travels north in appalling weather, but he's unable to continue due to his worsening condition. And he actually dies on July the 7th, 1307, at Berg by Sands near Carlisle, just south of the Scottish border. And his death occurred while he was still engaged in his efforts to try and capture Robert the Bruce. Edward was buried in Westminster Abbey, and I think this is really quite the telling tale because his tomb bears the inscription Edwardus primus Scotorum malus hic est, pactum severa. Here lies Edward I, hammer of the Scots, keep the faith. This epitaph, it reflects his enduring legacy as a formidable opponent of Scottish independence and tells you how much he really hated Scotland and the Scots. Bruce, in the meantime, in lieu of Edward's death, continues with guerrilla warfare tactics, taking castle after castle and burning everything English in his wake. Robert the Bruce then defeats the English at the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307. And this is where we see for the first time James Douglas enter the records, or the Black Douglas as he was known. And Douglas actually became a figure of fear among the English due to his, relentless and brutal attacks. His raids into northern England were particularly notorious. And these raids were the ones that gave him the moniker, the Black Douglas. And actually, another story that I'm just remembering is actually, even with his time under Robert the Bruce, the Black Douglas actually besieged and destroyed his own castle because they had an English army garrisoned inside it. He was a ruthless opponent. And this kind of takes us nicely to Stirling Castle and the Battle of Bannockburn. So Robert the Bruce and his army had stationed themselves just outside of Stirling, in a place that we now call Bannockburn. On the 23rd of June, 1314, Edward II and his army approached Stirling from the south, and they needed to cross over the Bannockburn stream to get there. And in the months leading up to the battle, Robert the Bruce and his men had, on the northern side of this stream, dug quite large pits and trenches, roughly the depth of your average soldier's knee. And at the bottom of this trench were sharpened wooden spikes that had been driven into the ground. And of course, then they'd been covered with grass and the like, and they'd been allowed to grow over it so that they were completely camouflaged. And the idea was that as the British crossed the stream, they would then have to gallop up a bit or run up a small bank, expecting flat ground in front of them and then fall into the trenches. This is a great offensive move that the English are just not expecting at all. And keep in mind, it's now not Edward I who's in charge of this army. As I mentioned, he's died. It's now Edward II, and he doesn't have the battle-hardened experience that his father had. As I also mentioned before, the Scots are voracious at hand-to-hand combat. They're not only good at it, they love the physicality of it. But what Robert the Bruce does is very clever. He prepares them mentally for what's about to take place. He knows that they're going to be outnumbered at least 4-1, but he gets it in their head that numbers don't matter. The Scots fight with axes and spears, and at this stage, they are the best in the world with those two weapons. And they've been training for months in the dense forests when no one could see them, unbeknown to the English. Do you remember that I said to you that William Wallace had used schiltrons when Wallace had led the army at Falkirk? So keep in mind, these schiltrons, they're hedgehog-like formations where up to 1,000 men gather in a circle with 12-foot lances. And the big downfall for William Wallace was that the schiltrons were static. The big difference here is that the Bruce made them moving, and they trained to move them quickly, efficiently, and they could attack fast in these formations. So just before the battle begins, early in the morning, the sun is just rising, the armies are just about to face each other, and Robert the Bruce rides out by himself and positions himself on a hill alone, on a fast pony that just has a saddle. There's no armor on it. This is highly unusual because usually the king's horse is larger and it's covered in armor. Not this morning. He wants the English to see him. He is wearing the garb that makes him kingly. He has gilded armor, a helmet with a crown attached to it, a surcoat showing off his coat of arms. He wants to be seen. There could be no mistake who this man is. And he carries one weapon, his battle axe. A young English knight by the name of Henry de Bohun sees him alone on the hill. The de Bohun's founder, Humphrey de Bohun, accompanied William the Conqueror during the invasion of England in 1066, and he was rewarded with extensive lands in England and Ireland. Henry de Bohun screams to no one in particular, "The king, the king, the king is mine," and he starts charging towards Robert the Bruce. Henry de Bohun, keep in mind, is on a large war horse that is decked in armor. It's heavy, it's cumbersome, and he carries a lance, a sword, and an axe. Robert the Bruce hears him and turns slightly in his saddle and urges his pony with a nudge, and he sits and watches as the knight, galloping, thunders towards him. De Bohun lowers his lance at full speed, pointing straight towards Robert the Bruce's chest, and screams, knowing that he will hit his mark. Just before de Bohun gets there, Bruce kicks his horse in the side, which makes the horse sidestep by just a foot. De Bohun's lance misses, and before de Bohun can register that he has missed his mark, the Bruce stands in his saddle. As de Bohun passes him, He raises his axe and smashes it down squarely on de Boon's helmet, smashing through steel, skull, jaw, and cleaving the knight in half. The knight falls from his horse, and Robert the Bruce turns to his troops and waves. He holds his axe high. Can you imagine the psychological effect that is going to have on the Scottish army and the demoralizing effect it's going to have on the English army? Interestingly, even though the English outnumbered the Scots 4-1, manpower wasn't something that really concerned Robert the Bruce. Men that had turned up the night before the battle, days before the battle, he turns them away because they hadn't been training with him over the last 7 months. They hadn't been practicing with him. The English, under Edward II, still didn't take him seriously. They went with their traditional form of cavalry leading the charge, the heavy horse, followed by archers, followed by infantry. However, because of Bruce's moving schiltrons, the traditional charge of the cavalry ran into a straight line of soldiers. Well, that was now defunct. So what you have going into the battle is tactical excellence from the Scots and relative incompetence coming from the English. Edward II's father had died in 1307, and right from the beginning, Edward II was playing catch-up. And if truth be told, he wasn't putting the manpower or the excellence into his strategic decisions. He honestly didn't give the battle enough thought. He was also incredibly unpopular among his own nobility and in Westminster. And there had been massive political unrest. And because of that, certain noblemen refused to join Edward II's northern army, including his powerful cousin Thomas of Lancaster. Thomas of Lancaster was the largest landowner in northern England. He had a lot of men and power behind him. Edward, however, did bring some of his father's veterans with him, including Henry Percy. And the Percy family were the Wardens of the North, so also a very powerful family. And also Robert Clifford, who had served with his father in Scotland before. But their expertise, strangely, was ignored, and they were not allowed to lead men. Counter that with the higher-ranked officers arguing amongst themselves, the morale was low. Leadership was now incredibly important. And Robert the Bruce chose the leaders that he fought with. He knew them. He trusted them. So there is a real regard for unity from the Scots right from the start. The battle itself was split over 2 days, which is demonstrative of the English at this point. The main source of information about the battle is actually from Sir Thomas Grey, who is the father of Thomas Grey, the author of a famous chronicle called the Skull Chronicler. And it's from this account that historians actually get a lot of information about the battle itself. So Thomas Grey was a knight on horseback, and he was captured on the first day of battle on June the 23rd. Keep in mind, knights wore their full regalia. They were announcing to the world who they were and how important they were. And of course, if the Scots saw you, they wouldn't massacre you if they caught you. They would actually take you prisoner because you were more valuable. You had more value as an information source than you did of them just killing you on the field. And from his accounts, what we do know is that the vanguard, the leading part of the advancing English army, attacks the Scots as the rest of the English army is actually setting up their camp. So this actually suggests that they were so keen to attack that they didn't wait for the rest of their army. So this is without the support of their archers. And keep in mind, the archers are one of the most important parts of the English army, these longbow archers that can shoot arrows from over 250 feet. As I mentioned, the battle went on for 2 days, but a lot of that was actually the English moving around to try and get an advantage, and they couldn't. So come day 2, the battle starts as the sun rises. So the English archers take out the Scottish archers because the English have the longbow and they can shoot at a greater distance. And it's a very misty morning. And as the mist rises, the English can see that the entire Scottish army are on their knees praying to God. As this is taking place, the English cavalry are trying to organize themselves. And strategically, they've placed themselves very badly between two rivers, the Bannockburn on one side and the Powell Stream on the other side. So they didn't have the usual space that they needed to fan out in one large line. And instead of kind of hurtling forward towards the Scots in a straight line, There's a bit of a panic going on because they're kind of hurtling into each other. They're bumping into each other. They're too confined in their space. And of course, while this is happening, the Bruce gets his men into 3 Schiltron formations of about 1,000 men each, and they attack in their hedgehog or armadillo type formations with their spears sticking out and their shields covering each other. And it was incredibly effective. No one had seen these Schiltrons moving the way they moved. And what's very clear is that no one can penetrate them. Gilbert de Clare, the king's nephew, charges at the first Schiltron with his knights, trying to, and you have to make a guess at this, to break them up because it's a suicidal charge and he's killed immediately. At this stage, the English are probably thinking, oh my God, what's going on here? As the Schiltrons are moving forward at pace, the cavalry is being forced back into the archers, and the archers are being forced back into the infantry, so there is panic and chaos. And the Scots are completely ruthless. As the Schiltrons keep moving forward, the knights are pushed into the river and there are people drowning. The horses are falling and then overrunning archers and infantrymen. And it's at this stage that Edward's guards say, we have to leave. The battle is lost. Edward then flees to Dunbar Castle, where he takes a ship from Dunbar down to the town of Berwick, and he is now being chased by James Douglas, the Black Douglas. He knows this, and it's lucky for Edward that he is never caught. The battle is over, and the Scots were victorious. The losses to the English were anywhere between 6,000 and 11,000 men. The Scots lost perhaps 1,000 men. It was the greatest English defeat in history. And one thing that I was thinking about then was that there was also a massive loss of nobility. Like so many knights lost their lives, which then led to families that guarded the borders no longer having that ability. It also led to very powerful people, including Thomas of Lancaster, befriending Robert the Bruce because they could see what was coming. And it was just after this battle that they started communicating again. Directly after the battle, Edward lost a lot of power at Westminster, where he was restrained by a number of ordinances that were effectively new rules with regards to how he was allowed to act as King of England. In Scotland, however, it allowed Robert the Bruce to create a statute that divided England and Scotland. And what he did immediately was stripped all Scottish lords of their land holdings in England. He didn't want them flip-flopping. And because of that, families were then split by allegiance. It created a very messy division of loyalties with nobles openly choosing sides. However, the victory of Bannockburn, it changed not just England and Scotland, but it also changed Ireland too. Edward the Bruce, Robert the Bruce's brother, invaded Ireland shortly afterwards and won Ireland over and promptly crowned himself High King of Ireland. And the main reason for taking Ireland was that Edward I regularly used Ireland to send troops across to attack Scotland from the west coast. So by taking over Ireland, they stopped that from ever happening again. Well, that was the idea at least. He was also, in a way, trying to forge a Celtic alliance. And it actually worked for a long time, and then for various reasons, it didn't. Keep in mind also that there were lots of English earls in Ireland as well, who held massive private armies. And when the Great Famine then happened, and Edward the Bruce couldn't feed his troops, his position weakened, and he was eventually killed in battle. Of course, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. And in England, after Bannockburn, this was also a time of massive baronial rebellion. Edward II was curtailed. The barons were revolting up and down the country. And, Edward even had his own cousin executed after the Battle of Boroughbridge. England was in a mess, and Edward II wasn't able to even focus on Scotland. And this is a time when raiding was at its absolute worst. Robert the Bruce and the Black Douglas kept raiding into the north of England, and Edward did nothing about it at all. The northern cities ended up paying huge amounts of money to Robert the Bruce not to raid, to leave them alone. And on the back of that, he was actually becoming very, very rich and very successful. And on the other side of that coin, Edward much less so. It took another 14 years and Edward III to come to an agreement with the Scots alone. You know, Bannockburn was a real David and Goliath moment. It was actually the battle that shaped Scottish history. But then as I delved deeper into it, I wondered, well, what are the myths that actually surrounded that battle? Because there were so many stories. And I think there's a few. I think the fact that the Scots are massively outnumbered is one. You know, we don't really know because no one actually really counted the troops, but it was certainly 3-1, maybe even 4-1. But given the terrain and the slowness of the regiments to actually join the battle, it wasn't as exaggerated as people stated. Also, this wasn't a surprise battle. Historians have frequently said that the English just turned up and Robert the Bruce had to defend Scotland. We know for sure that he had been training his troops for at least 7 or 8 months. So this battle wasn't a surprise. Also, there was then the rumor that they'd never fought again, that Edward II never fought the Scots again. Edward II definitely tried to get Robert the Bruce to commit to another battle. It was the form of the English. And it wasn't that Robert the Bruce refused, but they were successful guerrilla fighters. So there was no need for Robert the Bruce to go into a full-scale battle with Edward II. He was already beating him by using his guerrilla tactics. The last rumor I think that we can dispel is that Robert the Bruce was this incredible patriot from the start. He definitely wasn't. There was a lot of side changing leading into this battle and the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and Robert the Bruce changed sides more than once. He was both a Scottish and an English lord, and he may not have wanted to become king. And I don't think the killing of John Comyn was a planned event. And it was Comyn's demise that really put Bruce in a position where it was all, suddenly all or nothing. And in the end, it panned out rather well. England and Scotland, in my opinion, it wasn't a battle of England versus Scotland because the borders changed so much. It wasn't as though you could tell who was English and who was Scottish. You just couldn't. I think it was a battle in the end of political allegiance. So let's fast forward a little to 1329. After Robert the Bruce's death in 1329, the Black Douglas undertakes a mission to carry his friend Robert the Bruce's heart on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And he carries the heart in a small silver casket that he wears around his neck. He'd promised the Bruce that he would do it, and he promises the people of Scotland that he would do it. He gets as far as Spain during the Battle of Tiba, and suddenly, Douglas and his small army finds himself surrounded by a massive Moorish army. And he and his men absolutely know that they will die that day. There's no escape. Facing overwhelming odds, Douglas is said to have thrown the casket containing the Bruce's heart towards the enemy and shouted, "Forward, brave heart, as ever they're wont to do, and Douglas will follow thee or die." This act was actually intended to inspire his men and symbolize his undying loyalty to his king, to his friend. After throwing the heart, Douglas then charged into the thick of battle to where the heart had landed. He dismounts his horse and stands over the heart, and this is where he is killed in the ensuing fight. The legend then holds that his body, along with the Bruce's heart, was recovered by his comrades and brought back to Scotland. Folks, thanks for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the podcasts on Scottish independence, and I'll look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.